2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker.
Claire Curran.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering whether there's a bit of a split in the government over this bill, because it appears to me that Chris Bishop is very wedded to the prospect of party political broadcasts being shown on our state broadcaster. In fact, if he'd rather watch that than an All Black test, then I guess you've got to ask yourself a question of how in touch he is, and perhaps that's a signal that Ginny Anderson's going to win in Hutt South. On a more serious note, Mr. Speaker, this is a fairly straightforward bill. It's a fairly straightforward amendment to the Broadcasting Act 1989. Labor is supporting it to select committee, and I want to acknowledge the work that's clearly being done through the Justice and Electoral Inquiry into the 2014 general election, and the clear need to modernise communications to the public around election time. And it appears that there's a degree of unanimity around that. I do, however, want to introduce a note of caution in that this appears to have been a rather curious process, and while I'm acknowledging the process through the Justice and Electoral Inquiry, that there's been another process happening at the same time along with this election inquiry, and that these same measures and others have also been canvassed in a parallel process conducted by the Ministry of Culture and Heritage under the auspices of the Minister of Broadcasting, who happens to be the same person who is the Minister of Justice, who has been under her auspices, this particular piece of legislation has emerged. And why that's curious is that it seems that process seems to have been a bit left off to one side in this piece of legislation. And while and that process has actually got a name, and it was a discussion document that was called the Content Regulation in a Converged World, and it did a lot more than look at broadcasting election broadcasts or party political broadcasts during the election campaign. It actually is focusing on the effects of convergence in the media sector on the regulation of content in New Zealand, looking particularly at the requirements and restrictions relating to the classification of content, broadcasting of election programs and advertising times. And it also considered the government's interventions to support the production of broadcast content, all of which is pretty important. It was intended to be a health check on the existing frameworks, to ensure that they reflect the current media landscape and remain fit for purpose, which sort of reflects to some degree what the Minister just said in her speech around modernisation. But this parallel process doesn't appear to have sort of made it into the backgrounding that's formed this bill. And this review was put out to the public last year. There were a number of submissions. The submissions mainly, as you would expect, given it was a convergence review in the broadcasting environment, mainly those submissions came from the broadcasting sector. And they included submissions from Radio New Zealand, and I'm going to read you out a little bit about what Radio New Zealand had to say, because they're directly impacted by this and presumably will submit again in the select committee process. But they took the issue a lot more broadly and looked at it a lot more broadly than the narrow scope that's been provided for in this bill. And I think it is worth just noting that they say that the law must be clarified to ensure that advertising and editorial material are clearly and consistently distinguished from each other. That includes political satire that should not be constrained in any way by rules that apply to advertising. They say that, and they make the point, and I think it's a valid point, that Radio New Zealand and Television New Zealand once dominated the channels of distribution to media consumers, but are now just two of many participants competing for consumers' attention, both on air and online. And they also made the point that it's anomalous that Radio New Zealand is obligated to carry opening and closing addresses. But they also talk about the principles, a principle which was mentioned by a number of the submitters on this review, that a principle should be adopted that it is political parties that need to be regulated and not broadcasters, and that it's ironic that during general elections, the period of time in which the free flow of information and ideas is surely paramount, and that freedom of political speech and editorial coverage is restrained by the Electoral Commission. Those issues are pertinent and important, but this is a very narrow scope, this bill, and therefore, you know, this review that's just been undertaken is raising bigger issues, wider issues that should be being canvassed perhaps through legislation, perhaps through another process. But this bill, unfortunately, doesn't go there, and it looks as though it's going to be pushed through quite quickly. But we're not going to get the opportunity to actually have the conversation that perhaps we need to have. I'm also just going to quickly reference in the submission by the Coalition for Better Broadcasting that mentioned another issue, which again is not being canvassed, that it's apparent from cases such as the appearance of the Prime Minister talking with celebrities on an ostensibly non-election program on Radio Live, the complaints about which were rejected by the Broadcasting Standards Authority but upheld by the Electoral Commission, that there is a need to extend the definition of what constitutes an election-related program. Now, this is an important issue as well, and my concern is that we're not that this parallel process, which is raising important issues, doesn't appear to be being considered by the very same minister who's introduced this legislation, even though she's the one that initiated this review. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to just talk about the context of that review, because that review looked at a whole lot of other things. But this is, in 2 years, this is all that's emerged, this very narrow scope piece of legislation, while there are huge seismic shifts happening in our media sector at the moment, with two major media mergers being considered, where the future of Radio New Zealand is under a cloud because its funding has been frozen for 8 years. It's having to sell its Auckland business, its Auckland building, in order to be able to keep operating. Television New Zealand spending $60 million on refurbishing its building. There's a lot of things really out of kilter here. The future of media is really up in the air to a large degree in New Zealand. And here we've got a very narrow scope piece of legislation which looks as if it's the only one that will emerge in 3 years of this broadcasting minister, and that's even though she's doing this as the Justice Minister, and this is it. Apparently we're going to get a digital convergence bill which will address two other matters, which is the classification of content online and on television, to try and harmonise that, and also to look at the issue of advertising on television on Sundays. Well, both of those things are important, but they're hardly earth-shattering, are they? And the point I'm making is that there is a much wider context, there are much broader issues, some of which have been touched on by submitters on this parallel process that's been undertaken, which this minister clearly is not interested in touching. We will support 2 Select Committee. I'm looking forward to there being a robust discussion as a result of some of these submitters. Hopefully they will raise these issues when they come before the Select Committee.